Welcome to the first in a series of 3 videos on planning, implementation and evaluation. My name is Helen Friel and I'll be leading you through the first video, which is on planning, specifically in the context of tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. The series has been developed by Education Scotland's Attainment Advisor team and is intended to provide key messages, provoke thought and act as a starting point for further exploration, discussion or development within the areas covered. The aims of this video are to provide a model that can be used to support planning, to highlight the key elements essential for effective planning, and signpost some further sources of support. Before we move on to look at planning, I'd like to highlight a few key documents that you should be aware of as sources of advice and support. The Framework for Recovery and Progress underpins the ambition of the Scottish Attainment Challenge and provides direction and support for teachers and school leaders, as well as those working in other parts of the education system. Alongside this, schools should also look at the PEF National Operational Guidance and any complementary guidance from your local authority. The PEF Looking Inwards, Outwards, Forwards publication shares examples of practice from schools across all 32 local authorities. And the Scottish Attainment Challenge Self-Evaluation Resource shares features of effective practice and challenge questions to support schools to improve practice in improving outcomes for learners impacted by poverty. QR codes for all of these documents are on the useful link slide at the end of the presentation. When planning to tackle the poverty-related attainment gap, it's important to ensure a focus on all 5 elements from this diagram. Undertaking a contextual analysis will identify the gaps and help you to understand the underlying barriers to provide a robust rationale for your plan. Clearly articulated outcomes should then be identified, setting out the change you want to achieve. And for each outcome, a set of measures is required. Measures are the data that you will use to track the impact of your work and your progress in achieving your outcome. Once your outcomes and measures are all in place, the next step is to decide on the approach or intervention that will be most effective in your school's context to achieve the outcomes. And finally, implementation of your plan and the monitoring and evaluation of progress to ensure the approach or intervention is making a sufficient difference. Engagement with learners, families and partners should be a central element of your planning process, and consideration needs to be given to how and when this will take place to ensure that engagement is meaningful. When planning specifically for pupil equity funding, it should be remembered that this must provide targeted support for learners affected by poverty and their families if appropriate to achieve their full potential, focusing on targeted improvement activity in literacy, numeracy and health and well-being. Keeping this at the forefront of all PEF planning discussions will help avoid mission creep and the use of PEF in ways that do not contribute to raising the attainment and achievement of learners impacted by poverty. So looking at a contextual analysis in more detail now, a contextual analysis requires robust data to ensure the planning decisions that stem from it are targeted correctly. This should include a range of data, and it can be helpful to use the following headings to ensure that breadth. Demographics. The descriptive information about the school and its community. This might include levels of poverty and attendance and exclusion rates. School processes. The inputs that impact learners, including pedagogical approaches, the curriculum, tracking and monitoring processes, and pupil support. Pupil learning, the outputs, the impact for learners. This includes information on engagement, well-being, participation, attainment and achievement. And perception data, the views of staff, learners, parents and partners. This supports planning by providing insight into the impact of poverty and the barriers faced by learners and their families, and in identifying planning priorities and the approaches to be taken. Perception data also provides important feedback about impact. Including this wide range of data in your analysis and intersecting it, that is, bringing data from different headings together in the analysis, provides that really robust analysis and understanding of your school's context and avoids the error of making decisions based on inaccurate assumptions. Instead, the rationale for your plan will have a strong evidence base. Analysing your data this way will ensure you accurately identify the pupils in your school most affected by poverty, the barriers they face linked to that poverty, and the attainment gaps arising from these. Before identifying gaps, schools need to identify the learners impacted by poverty. Schools should consider learners in receipt of free school meals, learners living in SIND Quintile 1 postcode areas, learners from families in any of the priority groups most at risk of poverty, and local knowledge to identify other groups such as learners from traveller communities and learners affected by rural poverty. There are 5 key indicators that will help identify gaps: attainment, attendance, exclusion, engagement and participation. If your school is not already gathering and analysing data in relation to these, this would be something to prioritise. To identify how learners affected by poverty are progressing, comparisons should be made based on current data and data over time, and with local and national data. To quantify the gap, comparisons should be made with learners least affected by poverty, again looking at current data and data over time, as well as drawing comparisons with local and national data. You can see on the slide some starter questions for use when analysing data. Further questions will stem from the answer to these. Things to look for are patterns and trends, themes, anomalies, and ceilings on data. This type of analysis should look at data for learners impacted by poverty across the school, as well as taking a closer look at stages, cohorts, for example, looking at the data for a year group as they move through the school, and can also be done for individuals. As gaps emerge, schools should consider the underlying barriers. The examples of barriers shown here demonstrate that barriers are not exclusively found in families, at home and in the community. Schools can also be a source of barriers. Whatever the underlying barrier, it should shape the outcome and the intervention or approach to ensure an appropriately targeted response. There is no one-size-fits-all. For example, the approach taken to address low attainment caused by mental health issues impacting negatively on attendance will be very different to the approach taken to address low attainment stemming from limited cultural capital. Thinking about outcomes now, a good outcome focuses on learners and tackling the poverty-related attainment gap, and will identify clearly what will change, for which learners, by how much, and by when. This level of detail is necessary to be able to determine whether or not the outcome has been achieved and to what extent. When we use words like engagement, we can't assume everyone understands them the same way. Schools should therefore consider including an operational definition to support consistency where required. Outcomes can have short, medium and/or long-term elements, and an example of this would be a medium-term outcome to improve an aspect of health and well-being, with the longer-term outcome relating to increased attendance as a result. This is an example of an outcome that lacks a sufficient level of detail, and it will be difficult to determine whether or not this outcome has been successfully achieved as a result. It doesn't identify the target pupils, it doesn't quantify the amount of improvement expected, and it doesn't make clear the timescale for improvement. In addition, it would benefit from an operational definition detailing what improved engagement will look like. The outcome on this slide, on the other hand, provides sufficient detail, clearly identifying what, for whom, by how much, and by when. Including a baseline gives an indication of the scale of the improvement. Having the right data, looking at your data through an equity lens, and understanding the underlying barriers are all essential when creating outcomes in order to create the right outcomes. Come the 31st of May, it will be easy for the school to determine whether or not this outcome has been achieved. It's important to keep outcomes focused on the aim of raising the attainment and achievement of learners impacted by poverty. That might be via a direct focus on progress in literacy and/or numeracy, or an indirect focus such as improving health and well-being, attendance, engagement, or participation. In such cases, schools should consider also including a longer-term element to the outcome, which articulates the expected impact on attainment and/or achievement later on. This will help maintain a clear link to tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. This slide provides some prompts, a starter for 10 if you like, for creating outcomes. The what might be attendance, progress, or health and well-being. The who might be a small target group, an individual, or even a full cohort. For example, if data shows that pupils in receipt of free school meals are not participating in any clubs or are missing out on opportunities for achievement. In terms of by how much, it might be quantified using a percentage increase or decrease, or an increase or decrease in the number of occasions when something happens or doesn't happen. It might involve improvement on a graded scale. By when might be this PEF year or school year, it might be over a term or two, or it could be staggered with different timescales for different elements. An overarching long-term outcome to be achieved over 2 years or 3 years, broken into medium-term outcomes for each of those years. When identifying measures, it's helpful to ask what data will allow the school to identify whether or not improvement has taken place. It's important to keep measures manageable and proportionate. Think about what data is already gathered to avoid duplication. Measures are just the data you need to identify progress and impact. Give consideration to how often data will be gathered. The frequency will very much depend on the outcome and may be daily, weekly, monthly, or termly. This slide shows some examples of the types of measures that might be used under the headings of engagement, health and well-being, attainment, participation and achievement. Again, the lists are not exhaustive. Measures might include a mix of qualitative and quantitative data, and schools should think about using before and after surveys as well as observations to gather evidence of impact. When considering interventions, it can be helpful to think of them under the themes of leadership, learning and teaching, and families and communities. Leadership interventions focus on school culture and ethos to develop practice that better supports equity and increases the focus on tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. Learning and teaching interventions include direct support to accelerate progress. And families and communities would include direct work with families, for example, to increase parental skills and confidence in supporting homework. Schools should consider which interventions will have the greatest impact, and resources such as the Looking Inwards, Outwards, Forwards publication, the Interventions for Equity framework, and the Education Endowment Foundation's Teaching and Learning Toolkit provide examples of successful approaches to support schools when planning their own interventions. Before deciding on an approach or intervention, ensure it aligns with the outcome you're trying to achieve. Parents, carers and pupils should be involved in the planning process, with schools ensuring that this is done in a way that isn't stigmatising. Participatory budgeting is one mechanism that can be used, and further information about this is contained within the National Operational Guidance for PEF. Schools should also consider how other partners can support their work. The youth work and third sector documents shown in the slide provide guidance in relation to working with partners, and links to these can be found on the last slide. It's important that everyone linked to the intervention understands how it will contribute to tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. And when planning interventions and approaches, sustainability should be considered. How can impact beyond the term of the intervention itself be built in? For example, perhaps through professional learning. This slide shows a few prompt questions for schools when monitoring and evaluating impact. It's important to consider not only whether improvement is evident, but also is the level of improvement sufficient. Where there are concerns about the rate of progress, or indeed a lack of progress, schools should consider whether or not this is due to issues with the intervention itself, or is related to issues in how the approach or intervention has been delivered. Sometimes interventions can impact in ways not considered in the planning process, and schools should be alert to this. Unintended consequences can be positive, but they can also be negative. And where an intervention is not delivering the required impact, schools should not be afraid to review the plan, adapt the intervention as appropriate, or even stop the intervention and take a different approach. Implementation and evaluation are covered in detail in the remaining 2 videos in this leadership series. This slide provides some challenge questions for you to consider in relation to your planning process. These and other challenge questions from the SAC Self-Evaluation resource will help you, your school community and relevant partners to identify the strengths in your existing process that can be shared with others, while also identifying those aspects of planning that require further development. We've now come to the end of this leadership short on planning. Further advice in relation to planning is available from your Attainment advisor and using the links to other sources of advice provided on this slide. Thank you for listening.